welcome everybody. I'm happy to see this room full for such a select yet important conference. In fact, when Gayatri, Spivak and I met at that Housing for All Plots, the Amsterdam Cafe, over a year ago, she said to me, David, you know, we have had such a good array of conferences at the Italian Academy. We have had critical conferences on globalization. Subalternity has not been far from our concerns for many years. We had Jacques Derrida come with Gayatri to give one of his last great conferences here. And so Gayatri said to me, I think we have to do a conference on Gramsci and Kant. Now, as you know, you may not know, but if you look at my superfluous biography here, superfluous only because it has nothing to do with the today's events, you will see that from my amateur perspective, the notion of joining Gramsci and Kant seemed absolutely stupefying to me. But I know that Gayatri always has very good and stimulating and important ideas, and I said, now in my ignorance, can you explain to me how we are going to link Kant and Gramsci? And so Gayatri typically set out a convincing case for inserting the problem of education and the problem of women, two important factors in our daily lives, especially here at the Italian Academy, and perhaps at all educational institutions in the world. And she outlined a project that has resulted in today's conference. I have to say that the devotion with which she has set about putting together the speakers today, and I want to welcome all of the speakers who've come so far, especially Ursula Arpich, who I think is the only person who has come from across the Atlantic, although whenever I have an argument... Oh, excuse me, Lucas Carantino. Lucas Carantino, ma lui è italiano, dove sta? Dunque, è più o meno di casa. And Sven Trappelun has also come. So thank you all three. Sven, I have no reason to justify my omission here. Thank you for making, in the way that I do have in the case of Lucas Carantino. But thank you all for making this long trip. And actually, what I was about to say, that I want to thank also Mika, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth for coming so far as well, because when you think about it, coming from Texas to New York is almost like coming from Frankfurt to New York by the time you got on a plane and traveled across this vast country. So thank you all for coming to this conference, which was really envisaged, ideated by Gayatri. Of course, you know, I shouldn't be here to welcome you at all, and I don't feel any right even to give you my blessing, except to wish you a very good conference. But in a way, it's very important for us at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America. This is the year in which I'm a natural skeptic, and I'm even more skeptical about birthdays and celebrations of all kinds. This is the year of the 150th anniversary of what the Italian government is calling Italian unity. Some might think this unity might be even more striking. But if there is a figure who really merits attention in this year, it is the figure of Antonio Gramsci. And I notice with some distress that Gramsci, although of course remained a hero for many in Italian life, both educational and in a way daily life, I suppose the question of the work in the role of Gramsci in the subaltern's life has more or less disappeared from Italian discourse, but he seems to me a figure who really needs to be reinserted in a critical way in not only in the Italian philosophical tradition, but in the world philosophical tradition. And there is, of course, I'm honored to be able to introduce this just really because of Gayatri here and for her role in the explanation, exposition, and the insistence on the relevance of Gramsci's ideas of subalternity. I'm also moved by the fact that the Schucht sisters, about whom Ursula Arpich will speak shortly, will play a role in today's conference for their own critical contribution to the development and dissemination of Gramsci's thought. This is an aspect of the history of the Gramscian story, which of course has fallen out. It is known to you, but it cannot be emphasized enough. And of course, with our own educational mission, the importance importance of Gramsci's ideas about education need re-evaluation as well. I can think of no other conference which has dedicated itself to these critical topics. Now, the link with Kant obviously will be something that you will all devote your attention to. It's not a link which I think has been much explored, I suspect more than I know, but it's interesting. Just yesterday, and I wonder whether Professor Ellis will talk about this in her talk, perhaps others of you as well. Just yesterday I was sent an article from the, written by a friend of mine for the Frankfurter Allgemeine, in which he discussed the question of the legitimacy of the intervention in Libya at this moment, which of course is a really critical thing that is worrying most of all of us. And Merkel, not Mrs. Merkel, but Reinhard Merkel, reminded us of a very critical passage, which perhaps will come again to the fore in our discussions, critical passage in the Perpetual Peace. And I read section 5 of the Perpetual Peace to you, which is obviously something which the Bush government had no conception of. Obama might have, but I don't think he attended as carefully as he might have to section 5 of the Perpetual Peace. Has anybody reread the Perpetual Peace recently? Perhaps it'll come up today, but just to get us going here, we are moving away from the main topic of the conference, but you can see how this will certainly fit. You will talk. Can I just say it very briefly? Section 5 says, no state shall by force interfere with the constitution or government of another state. And he actually begins by saying, for what is there to authorize it to do so? The offense, perhaps, which a state gives to the subjects of another state, rather the example of the evil into which a state has fallen because of its lawlessness should serve as a warning. Then he goes on to say something much more interesting and much more relevant, 2 parts. But it would be quite different if a state, by internal rebellion, should fall into 2 parts, such as is happening all over the Islamic world and North Africa at the moment, each of which pretended to be a separate state making claim to the whole. To lend assistance to one of these cannot be considered as an interference in the constitution of the other state, for it is then in the state of anarchy. But then comes the big but. But so long as the internal dissension has not come to this critical point, such interference by foreign powers, this seems to be totally irrelevant to today, such interference by foreign powers would infringe on the rights of an independent people struggling with its internal disease. Hence it would itself be an offense and would render the autonomy of all states insecure. So I think that's a clear articulation of the concerns that perhaps lie beneath many of our thoughts, perhaps not everyone, but certainly there it is articulated as always, as clearly as you could imagine, as affirmatively as one can imagine by Kant. So once again, Gayatri has brought to the Academy a meeting of enormous relevance for concerns that have preoccupied us for a very long time, but also which have the highest pertinence to our thinking today. Thank you, Gayatri. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you enjoy the conference.
Welcome. I'm also very happy indeed to see you. I'm Gayatri Spivak, whom David mentioned. David called himself an amateur. I am also an amateur. I was that, in fact, I'm trained in British literature, like many Indian folks of my generation, and even my entry into comparative literature was simply because at that point in time, many years ago, 50 years ago, I could not get a fellowship in English because I was not a native speaker at Cornell University. And so therefore I was obliged with small French and less German to enter comparative literature. So therefore I'm totally an amateur in Gramsci studies and Kant studies. I'm a literary person. But it is, as David mentioned, I had this idea as an amateur, and I wanted to hear the specialists the real specialists speak, because generally speaking, it's been my experience, and I'm sure it's been yours, that people who are really secure in their specialist work are not nervous about amateurs coming in, reinventing the wheel. And I wanted to see how much of these amateur imaginings would last if it were, and so my friends have in fact come forth to help all of us make connections that are not usually made. I should thank not only David for lending me an ear. I'm going to be as Britlit as possible. That might not have been the appropriate quote, but at any rate, the Romans. But I want to thank not only David, but Barbara Feida, Alison Jeffries. They were unbelievable in setting this conference up, the real professionals. I think Eric Mazel in my office and I were swimming in uncharted waters, and I hope Eric will agree that we worked okay as a team. But so we offer you this conference cobbled together by friends and amateurs in the hope that we will have something worth listening to. I should also mention, this is an idiotic thing to mention, but it will otherwise look very strange. I'm going to be sitting there. I have a severe case of bursitis, so from time to time I have to stand up and walk, otherwise I will be like immobile. So if you suddenly see myself stand up and make a circuit and sit down, don't think that amateurism has gone to insanity. It will simply be because I gotta watch this aging frame. This is indeed an odd couple. I should put it. This is indeed an odd couple. Odd couple. Remember that movie? Two men. Remember Walter Matthau answering the phone saying divorce, broken, happy. Now that's what we have taken care of. These are not two men who are happy because they're not with women. This is a difference. The education angle certainly is a difference. The education stuff, let me put before you why I thought about this. It's very odd. Every time that there is a discussion of academic freedom in this country, we always begin with Kant, as if there were no problems with intellectuals anywhere else in the world. And of course, China and India immediately come to mind. You cannot begin there. It's a noble beginning, but you cannot begin there. So, and on the other hand, anytime people talk about Gramsci, the idea, forgetting about the making of the subaltern intellectual, the idea that he was perhaps too much into Latinità is always trotted out. But somehow, since in the academy we suffer from academic subdivision of labor, the two never meet. And I thought, okay, if Kant is our father in education, the university is the public use of reason, and so on, and Gramsci, even the best Gramscians often make, and Joe is nodding his head, often make that kind of peculiar suggestion. Let's think the two together and see what happens. That's number one. Number two, and I'm very happy to mention this, and also melancholy, is Giorgio Barata. Now, many of you know his name in this crowd. I never met him. He would have been here if he had been alive. But we were in conversation, and he said something to this amateur which was incredibly heartwarming. He said to me, Gayatri, you have really got Nino's number. He was fundamentally interested in the problem of education, as you, in your way, are trying to understand. So he kind of gave me the sort of encouragement that people who know their subject very, very well, as I mentioned, give to people who do not know the subject that well, but is moving, perhaps, in the right direction. So I have that authorization as well. Now, in terms of the introduction of the question of woman, now Hamann already knew that in Kant's own time, that Kant had not been perhaps as just to women as he should have been. And there have been, in fact, early wave of academic feminism books where Kant has been thoroughly criticized for this. Now, I'm not interested, we cannot be interested in that anymore. So I would mention here, and I see there are some in the audience who have heard me say this before, I would mention here that I myself try to follow a kind of politics of reading, which in a formula is do not excuse. If this complaint has been made, there are grounds for this complaint, but do not accuse because you throw the baby out with the bathwater if you keep yourself occupied with nothing but an accusation that would be only too clearly demonstrated. It's not worth it. I have the same attitude towards colonial discourse studies. Of course it will be too clearly demonstrated. One shouldn't simply go on and on in the accusatory mode. But enter the protocols of the great text, not just the logic, but the private grammar of the great text. Find the point where the text can be turned around itself and use. Do not accuse, do not excuse, but earn the right to use. And to an extent, I hope that the way we look at Kant's contribution to our thinking about education today will have something, some kind of relationship to that politics of reading. It's not just the same old about Kant and women. It's boring. So then with the question of Gramsci, it's a little bit different. The idea of that we did not pay enough attention to the Schucht sisters was broached by my friend Teresa de Laurentiis in the 70s in a feminist conference that I was part of in Minnesota. And this then became a chapter of the technologies agenda. Fantastic piece. And then the work of Ursula Arpich has really taken this and changed the situation in a major and almost single-handed way. I think this is, you will notice that funnily enough, I speak again in this first session. Actually, it's the same kind of format as the second session, two people speaking together, and it's Ursula and I speaking together, but because I really am very much the amateur here, I thought rather than giving us a kind of bureaucratic, egalitarian, equal time, it would be much better for Ursula to have the big chunk of time, and then for me to make some Kant connections, to talk about, to respond to Ursula again, and so on and so forth. So that's why you'll find Gayatri Spivak sitting there and speaking again, because in fact the structure is similar, and then Sven will respond and Joe will respond. Now, of course, part of what, it's 10:30 and I should stop, part of what I have to do, and it's a very pleasant task, is also introduce our two speakers. And I will go ahead and do it in a minute. Let me just mention the third point. I won't elaborate. I'll do that in my response time. The Enlightenment. We talked about women some. We talked about education some. And you've noticed that the subverting the Enlightenment in the title of the European Enlightenment, in the title of the conference. In this room, standing precisely here, we had a wonderful global poetry reading. I said some of the things that I will very briefly say, that the idea of how to deal with the European Enlightenment has significantly changed from all of the culture wars and accusations of Eurocentrism, etc., in what we now perceive as a kind of global contemporaneity. So I'm not going to say anything more right now, except to say that I have actually put my money where my mouth is. I have a book coming out in the fall called An Aesthetic Education, Subverting Schiller, and Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. It's a different attitude toward the European Enlightenment and using it, not excusing but not accusing, but using it, that I hope at the end of the day will have put before you in terms of the Enlightenment. Now I will go on simply, and now I think of Ursula Appich and Joe Buttigieg as friends. I relate to them in terms of my work in quite a different way, but it's always a pleasure to read the achievements, and I'll be very brief. I'll introduce both of them and I'll sit down. Ursula Appich, Professor of Political Science and Sociology in the field of Culture and Development at the Goethe University of Frankfurt-Main, Director of the Cornelia Goethe Center for Women's and Gender Studies. She was elected in 2007 as a member of the Executive Committee of the European Sociological Association. She has published in the fields of biography and the history of ideas with reference to gender, migration, and ethnicity, but for me, as I've already mentioned, the fact that she is the co-editor of the German critical edition of the correspondence between Giulia and Tatiana Schucht and Gramsci during his prison years, this has brought Ursula to my attention, and then her concern with subalternity, and again in the response, obviously, I want to be able to say something more about it. And her title today is very provocative indeed. It's a long title. It is, wait a second now. It's Revolution, Defeat and Subalternity. Antonio Gramsci in dialogue with Giulia and Tatiana Schucht. Revolution, Defeat and Subalternity. Again, we hope to be able to make some connections between the situation today in North Africa and West Asia before the day ends. And now for Joe. Joseph Buttigieg is really a hero for many, many of us because he put together for us who are obliged to teach in English the real prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci, those 29 things, and not Togliatti's confection of seeming books written by Antonio Gramsci, where even cut and paste, paragraphs shifted, titles introduced, and so on. So although one could indeed read the fact that Joseph Buttigieg is the Kenyon Professor of English and co-director of Italian Studies at the University of Notre Dame, he's published on James Joyce's Aesthetics, Portrait of the Artist, etc., the real thing he's written, criticism, his books, Criticism Without Boundaries, and so on and so forth. His real contribution to the community of scholars is this unbelievable work, very careful work. I use it all the time, therefore I know whereof I speak. Both Appich and Buttigieg are my teaching aids, and I think Columbia University Press is to be congratulated for publishing this, and even more now for making it available to students and scholars alike by publishing it in paperback. So I should mention at this point, before I leave the floor and begin the proceedings, that I'm very much hoping, and I've been needling Ursula Appich about this. She's very enthusiastic. I hope I corral Judith Butler for this. She's at Princeton speaking today, so she couldn't come. Our translation, our English translation of the letters of Giulia and Tatiana Schucht, full, not selections, by several hands, with a good solid introduction and annotations. Wish us well. I hope Columbia University Press will look kindly on that as well. So I've said a lot because this is not an empty introduction. It really has shown you my pleasure that you're sitting in this room today, and I hope you'll stay with us. I know you're busy, but let the room remain pretty much full all day. It's a bold interdisciplinary conference with the odd couple and women thrown in and a little bit of revolution. So thank you for coming, and I declare the conference open. Here's the Butler Champagne.